everybody. I'm Sian Hansen, the Executive Director here at Legatum Institute, and thank you so much for coming to our event tonight. As an international think tank with a huge number of internal US policy experts, we felt it was timely and only right to host an event looking at the race to the White House. There can be little doubt that this presidential race has gripped people, not only in the US, but across the world. The rise of the populist leaders such as Trump and Sanders has to date meant that policy has been replaced by personality politics. At some point over the next couple of months, as you know, both the Republican and Democrats will select their nominee, and the debate will then hopefully move on to more serious discussions. At the Legatum Institute, we've been focusing a large part of our work stream on the need to ensure that markets function properly, and that ultimately the distrust that people have with free market capitalism has led to the rise of these populist politicians in both the US and across the world. Tim Montgomery, one of tonight's speakers, has kicked off this work here at Legatum Institute with his excellent project, Prosperity for All. And here it is, the first hard copy version just came out an hour ago. And we're just thrilled that you've been able to take a break from covering the US elections for the Times and be with us tonight. Tim is also a Legatum Fellow. And also we have here Shankar Singham. Shankar has just joined us actually and is now going to run our Economics of Prosperity program for us, but actually has been economic advisor to Marco Rubio. And then finally, of course, Anne Applebaum, who hardly needs any introduction. She's the columnist at the Washington Post, and of course she leads our work here on the Transitions Forum. But mostly I'd like to thank Tim Shipman for being here. Tim Shipman has agreed to moderate tonight's event. Tim is a leading British journalist and also happens to be currently the political editor at the Sunday Times. He's also covered the past two US presidential elections, so certainly knows a thing or two about the subject himself. So welcome to you all, and over to Tim.
Well, welcome everybody. It would be saying that Imelda Marcos is slightly fond of shoes to say that this is an interesting time in politics at the moment. I've hot-footed it from the House of Commons, where we're having extraordinary debates about a range of subjects today. I was talking to a cabinet minister earlier, and he said to me, look at this. We have a prime minister who won the first majority that a Tory leader has won in pushing 3 decades, who might be out of a job in 3 months' time. We have a chancellor who was seen to be almost an inevitable successor, who is now fallen flat on his face. And we have a leader of the opposition who is, to put it mildly, not from the mainstream of politics, and employs in his office people who are genuinely revolutionary socialists who would like to overthrow both democracy and capitalism. But stranger than all these things is that a man with a desiccated stoat on his head may well become the next president of the United States. And that, in short, is what we're here to discuss this evening. The phenomenon that we're going to talk about is not just about Donald Trump, but it seems strange not to start with Donald Trump. And overnight, we've had a victory for Trump in the Arizona primary. Hillary Clinton also won. Ted Cruz, they won Utah. So Trump's gain was only actually 18 delegates over Cruz. Trump now has 739. Cruz has 465. The race to 1,237 is very tensely poised. It's not a given that Trump will win the nomination, but he's well on the way to doing so. Today, if you've been on social media, this extraordinary US election has now descended into literal sort of catcalls about the candidates' wives. It's a pretty astonishing state of affairs. So let's start by trying to explain who Donald Trump is and why he's doing so well. So Shankar, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. I think what I'll do is, there's a lot of things going on here, obviously, that have given rise to the ascendancy of Donald Trump. But I'd like to just pick one area that I think is a real driver for what's happening here, which is I think there has been this rising tide of nationalism, protectionism, populism around the world. It's not just in the US, it's certainly in Europe as well. And I think that is something that has charged the Republican primary electorate. I think trade has always been a lightning rod in the most recent 3 US elections. Before Rubio, I was an advisor to Governor Romney, and we had exactly the same issue in 2012. We had very similar issues in 2008. There is, though, I think now a sense amongst the people who are voting for Trump, or frankly voting for Sanders as well, that the game is rigged against them somehow, that trade has been unfair, that they have lost out to competition with China, with other countries like China and developing countries, and that there is a palpable anger amongst the people in particularly those Rust Belt states, particularly Ohio, Michigan. These are the states where Bernie Sanders is doing very well, particularly winning Michigan, for example. So if you look at the voters who are voting for Trump, the voters who are voting for Sanders in those states, they're voting the same issue, I think, which is a very protectionist, we will protect you from foreign competition. What has happened to you in the past has been the result of, unfettered, quotes, free trade. In the Rubio campaign, we did try to address this issue and talk about, you have to be able to say to voters that if you lost your job because the factory closed down because of competition from whatever country it was, that was unfair. That if there were distortions in that market that led to that, we have to have an answer to voters. We have not so far had an answer. We either say free trade is good, free trade has winners and losers, end of story. You can't do that. You have to have a response, and it has to be real policies, and it has to be real rules. But you have to at the same time say but trade does lower the costs of energy and food and so on. And we've not been able to do that. And as long as we're not able to do that, I think Donald Trump will continue to resonate in many of these areas.
Anne, is this all about trade?
I think trade is an element. I would add a few more things, and I will limit them and not go on too long because you could say quite a lot. I think I would emphasize what Shankar just said by saying I think we're also seeing a delayed reaction to 2008 and 2009. The economic crash, the rescue of the banks, which necessary though it might have been to save the U.S. economy, left many people, and this is people of all classes, with the impression that the bankers were bailed out, but ordinary people weren't. And so particularly in the United States, more so than here, many, hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes while bankers survived, went on, kept making the same salaries, and seemed to do perfectly well. So, the dissatisfaction that event caused and the failure to discuss it or pull it apart later on, I think, is one of the other factors. Second factor is the Republican Party itself, which has been offering policies to its voters and became increasingly out of tune with its voters over the last few years. And I think that was in a way summed up by the kind of rush to nominate Jeb Bush. Which was unattractive on a number of grounds. The amount of money that he raised before the campaign even started, the number of people he had lined up behind him, the fact that it was, that he would be the third person of that surname who would have that job. It gave the impression of a sort of deeply nepotistic political party that I think felt out of line with what voters actually wanted. And I would say a third point I would make would be about the nature of, I would say, the Republican Party media, but it's not really the Republican Party media. A friend of all of ours, David Frum, has called it the Republican entertainment complex, or the conservative entertainment complex. There is the combination of some talk radio, but also the websites, television stations have been feeding a narrative about anger, about the illegitimacy of the Democratic Party, about the illegitimacy of democratic politics in the United States, that has finally, in a way, come home to roost inside the Republican Party. This idea that it's okay to be against everything and we're all against everything has been repeated, over and over again for the last decade by people who thought that the Republican Party was benefiting from it, and now I think what we've seen is that it's benefited it's maybe destroying the party itself. And I would say a third thing, which is that I know Shanker disagrees with me slightly, but I also think that there is an element of Trump's appeal which is not ideological and not even political at all. I was just reading a biography that a friend of mine has written, a new biography of Ronald Reagan. And the degree to which Ronald Reagan was a kind of creation of Hollywood was one of the themes of this book. But in the best possible sense, in that Reagan was Reagan sort of believed in a 1940s, 1950s idea about Hollywood, that good guys win and that the gentleman gets the girl. And he was a sort of embodiment of a set of values that were transmitted by the Hollywood of that previous era. And part of what people voted for him was he sort of looked like and was, in fact, a Hollywood good guy hero. I mean, he was a B-movie actor and not one of the famous ones, but in a way maybe that was better. People identified with him and with a sort of set of values that he seemed to represent. Trump also represents a set of values in American public life, and he represents entertainment television and reality television. Sorry, I don't mean entertainment, I mean reality television. And he represents a narrative that's now coming from the internet, and it's a narrative that is nihilistic. It celebrates a kind of celebrity idea of money. As a friend of mine was trying to describe the appeal of Trump, the kind of rich person he is, and he said, well, obviously, people don't admire him because he's on the board of the New York Public Library. They admire him because he has a wife who's had her photograph taken with no clothes on, and because he, has glossy mansions, and he, spends a lot of money. And so he's embodying an ideal of celebrity, an ideal of success, which is very much promoted now. It's funny, it's not so much in Hollywood, although that's a part of it, but around, on TV, on the internet, and so on. And so there's an Italian friend of mine has pointed out that it's very, very similar to the way in which Berlusconi was elected. I mean, Berlusconi talked a lot about ideas, and he talked a lot about being a free marketeer. Actually, when he was in office, he never did anything or did very little to change Italy at all. People kept voting for him because it wasn't about ideas in the end. It was about this idea of success, and he owns a football team, and he has lots of younger girlfriends, and that was why people were voting for him. And I think grappling with that is going to be much more difficult than grappling with the intellectual reasons why Trump is winning, because those are sociological and and cultural, really, rather than strictly economic.
This is a guy with his own plane. He won't need Air Force One. He has Trump written in 10-foot tall letters.
People have had their own planes before who've run for president, but they haven't had this kind of lifestyle, the lifestyle that's. I mean, Mitt Romney could have had lots of planes if he'd wanted planes, but what was his wife? His wife was did dressage and trained dressage horses, which was an extremely ladylike activity, So it's a very different way of being a rich person.
It's going to be an interesting first lady, I think it's fair to say.
That is for sure.
If he were to win. Tim, how do you explain Trump? What's your take?
I agree with most of what's been said so far, and I think the economic issues are very important. Trying to tie some of what Anne and Shanker have said together is that we all know from Britain, we know the vulgar personality. It's the ban on Muslims. It's the anti-Mexican rhetoric. That's the thing that's travelled perhaps across the Atlantic most clearly. It's what we're aware of, and perhaps helps to fuel why we find his candidacy most inexplicable. But there are plenty of positions that he takes, and I agree with what Anne says. It's not all perhaps even mainly about positions and policy, but there are plenty of positions that he takes that for so many Americans are much more sensible than the positions of the Republican Party or the mainstream politicians. So having done a YouGov poll on the question where we listed all of the policies that he was associated with and said which is the most important and resonant with you, twice as popular as the ban on Muslims, twice as popular as the wall to keep out Mexicans, which both scored about 35-40%, was protecting entitlements. Just the idea that unlike all of the other Republican candidates, for nomination, who constantly talk about cutting the deficit and cutting spending, he's the guy who says, I won't let them take your pension, in our words, their retirement and social security away from them. He's the person who says, when he was asked in one of the debates, would you shoot down planes over Syria? No. Now, all the others, I think, certainly Rubio and Chris Christie and Jeb Bush, were quite open to the possibility of shooting down planes. Now, for a lot of Americans who are completely exhausted by the Iraq war, it's the guy who won't shoot down planes is the one that they think is perhaps the more reasonable politician. And, it is a fact, although that I would much rather have had Rubio, marginally I'd rather have Ted Cruz, but only very marginally, as the Republican nominee. It is a real fact that the Republican leadership has got completely estranged from huge numbers of its voters. And before I left here in Legatum, London, and went over to the Times, I met a few friends and discussed what we would most change about America if we could wave a magic wand. And most of the people I was talking to said they would change guns, bring guns under control. But I thought beforehand, and I believe it even more now, I would change the money in American politics. The fact that every politician, up until Trump, had to raise so much money to advance in American politics. And what the money has done, at least for the Republican Party, it has produced an incredibly pro-immigration Republican Party that only sees benefits for their corporate entities in immigration. It only sees benefits in free trade agreements that are largely written for and by big businesses. And it doesn't really understand at all the social or other priorities of grassroots Republicans. So the one conversation that I have had more than any other that sort of answers your question, Tim, that crystallizes why so many Republicans are voting for Trump. And by the way, I'm not a Trump supporter, before any of you get the impression that I am, but I met a lady who'd been a Republican supporter, conservative donor for years and years and years. And she says, I want them to limit abortion. I give money so that they will limit abortion. And they always find an excuse why they cannot do it. Republican presidents, Republican senators, Republican congressmen. I want them to limit immigration so that the jobs market isn't under so much pressure. They always find a reason why they can't do it. I want them to look after my entitlements. There's always a reason why they have to be cut. But when corporate America goes to a Republican president or a Republican senator and says we want our taxes cut, we want the high rates of taxes cut, even though that's more unpopular than all of the other three things that woman wants, somehow the Republican Party finds the political capital that they're willing to do these things.
So, Shanky, you've been working for these guys. You work for Romney, you work for Rubio. What's gone wrong with the sort of the mainstream of the Republican Party? How has this divorce happened, and is there any way to resolve that?
Yeah, no, I think what Tim just said is absolutely spot on, actually. I think and that's why one of the most resonant things that Trump talks about is the fact that he doesn't have to go to people for money. There's a question about that anyway, but...
Well, there's a very good piece online on Real Clear Politics today that suggests Trump is actually running out of money.
Right, and there's a question about his liquidity and so on. But I think the major point that he's made that's really resonated with people is that, I'm not like these other people. And this also goes back to the rigged game that people think. They really do think that it's a rigged game by the establishment. If you look at the different counties in states that have really lost out from, quotes, liberalization, globalization, whatever you want to call it, these are the counties in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan. These are the places where the US election is going to be won or lost. And in all of these places, there is a very, very strong anti-establishment protectionist kind of force that's responding to a lot of this, and it's tied up with this rigged game. It's tied up with all of these things. I think the Republican establishment, you know, this is something that's happening to the Republican establishment that they have deserved, frankly, by failing to address these issues for all these years.
I wanted to pick you up. You were talking, Anne, about a reaction to 2008. We haven't talked about race at all. I mean, I found some staggering figures earlier that 63% of Trump supporters want to end birthright citizenship for children of immigrants, that only 21% of Trump supporters think Obama was born in the US, 66% think he's a Muslim. Is there a racial element to this as well? People talk about angry white men. Is that what this is all about?
Well, so there are two aspects to the race angle, if you will. I mean, one is to do with, you know, immigrants and people born out of the country, and the other is to do with blacks, who are obviously not immigrants. And I think they're separate. I mean, there is a good argument. I mean, these are all speculative. That one of the things that's feeding the anger, or so apparent anger, I'm not sure how much of it is real and how much of it is concocted, but the apparent anger of Republican voters at the moment is the sense that you know, somehow Obama's presidency upended the racial hierarchy, and that, you know, we need to get back to where we were before, and we need to make sure that, and this is, I'm not advocating this argument, I'm just saying it's one that people are making. We need to get back to where we were before and restore, you know, the primacy of people who look like us, and that's part of what's winding people up. And there is certainly a strand of that argument is something that you can hear in the more extreme, and not even that extreme, but the talk radio, Fox News, some of the, you know, the argument that Obama was somehow an illegitimate president. Either he's illegitimate because he was born in Kenya, or he's illegitimate because he's a Marxist, or he's, you know, there've been a number of arguments that say he shouldn't really be president. These arguments some are connected to, sometimes they aren't said to be racist arguments, but that's somehow they've tapped into that same vein of anger. And I think the party, and not all the party, but some members of some part of the party and part of the Republican media are responsible for pushing this, for pushing this feeling that people seem to have. So I think that is one of the underground things that's underlying this. I mean, on the question of immigrants, I mean, again, it's very complicated. You know, the statistics show that there is actually less immigration now than there was, and the number of foreigners has been going down. And it's always been, you know, in the U.S., it's always been very closely related to the economy and the nature of economic growth, and supposedly it's been going down in the last few years. But the anger has been somehow building nevertheless, and it seems to be often unconnected to whether people live in states that have a lot of immigrants or just a few immigrants. And so that leads me to believe that it's also somehow not, you know, it's not imaginary, but it's also connected to images of what it means to be an American, or my role in my country, or national identity, rather than direct economic competition.
You're right. Immigration is down to relative levels, but of course we're also saying this is the slowest economic recovery of modern times. So it's in the context when actually there's less money to go around, and so therefore the competition for resources is that more intense. So it's always the immigrant, the welfare claimant, the outsider, always sort of is more resented in that environment, which is why I think probably it's the economic stagnation, the slow growth period we may be entering, that might actually be the bigger explanation for this phenomenon than actually the crash of 7 or 8 years ago. Because if we were having a relatively good recovery from that period, I think people would be more willing to forgive and accommodate.
No, I agree with that. You're absolutely right. I don't disagree with you at all. I just think it's not entirely economic. It's not entirely explained by economics or by people feeling in competition with groups or with people they can see.
The Marxist in me blaming economics. Yeah.
It's also a jobless recovery. I mean, this is one of the big problems is the unemployment rates. You know, the unemployment rate you hear about it seems to be fine, but that's not really the unemployment rate. The U6 unemployment rate is much higher than that. The graduate unemployment rate, you know, recent college graduates, is very high. And again, it all goes back to this issue that, you know, somehow Middle America has lost out to this, and the whole generation has lost out to this. I'm not sure that the race issue is really such a big factor, but I don't think that the what is resonating about Trump are those things. I mean, as Tim said, you know, you hear the headlines, but that's not why people are going to him. I mean, in fact, in many cases, I think a lot of people vote for him and then give him a free pass with some of these things. They say, oh, it's Trump being Trump, you know, he doesn't really mean it, or we don't really care what he's saying. But it's this issue of he's going to speak for me, he's going to represent me, and none of these other people will.
Now, lots of people in politics have made a lot of predictions over the last 18 months, and pretty well every last one of them has turned out to be completely wrong. But it does look like we might be heading for a brokered convention. How does this play out now? Does he get the nomination, or does the establishment try to stop him? And if they do, what does that mean? What happens?
It's not just the establishment trying to stop him. There will be a legitimate question if we get to the convention and he doesn't have a majority. And, you know, which means, in fact, that there's a majority of other people who have more votes than he does. Then there's a legitimate question about whether he's the party's candidate. And actually, 20, 30 years ago, we used to have conventions in which people would vote and then re-vote, and it was considered a normal. It was normal that you would get to the convention without knowing who it was. And it's only in the recent decades that we've had these conventions that are sort of coronation ceremonies. And much more boring, therefore, as a result.
But what do you think? I mean, would it be sensible to try and stop him in that way? I mean, he says, I'll go elsewhere, I'll take my people with me. It's not impossible he'd run as a third-party candidate himself. Is it sensible for the Republican establishment to stop?
It'll be maybe too late by then for him to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there are sore loser rules, and there are reasons why it might be difficult for him to actually do that. But nevertheless, you know, he could cause a lot of problems. And the bigger thing that I think the Republican Party, the establishment, is worried about is if he's treated badly in the convention, you know, and his voter base, which is a very significant voter base, feels like he has been treated badly, then a U.S. election, you know, turnout is very low generally. So your ability to get your base out is incredibly important. And if that's at risk, then the party will be very concerned about it. So there's a limit to how far they can really push. And it depends, a lot of it depends on how close he is to the line. He may be over the line. It may not be a brokered convention. I mean, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I would have said, yes, it's going to be a brokered convention. But I'm not so sure about that now. Even if it is a brokered convention, he's going to be quite close to the line. Can you really say, I mean, there are many people now who have said, you know, can you really say, no, we're going to find some other candidate or find some other deal? Who is the other candidate that you would find? It's certainly my former, person I advised many years ago, Mitt Romney. I mean, he is not the candidate that would...
Well, Jonah Goldberg has written a piece today in which he says the perfect candidate to stop Trump would be Ronald Reagan or Batman, and neither is available. So, does he get it, Tim, do you think? Does he get the nomination?
I think he probably should. And the polling of Republican activists is that even if he doesn't get a majority, they think he should get the nomination. That if he gets something like 40, 45%, and Shanker's right, YouGov did a poll and they said if it can't be Trump, who else can it be? Well, Paul Ryan gets 3%, Mitt Romney gets 6%. There's no one else.
Ted Cruz?
You know, Ted Cruz is about 20-odd%, you know, similar to his opinion poll rating nationally. So there isn't Batman or Ronald Reagan waiting in the wings to be the nominee. So the Republican Party potentially risks the wrath of its base. Only 34% of Republican voters are in the never Trump category, who say do everything at all costs to stop him getting the nomination.
Yeah, but if they all vote Hillary, then that's the end of the Republican Party.
Of course it is. That's another question. One of the reasons why the convention might be more messy than we think is those delegates, 1999 delegates from Florida that are all allocated to Donald Trump. On the first vote, they have to vote for him. But a lot of these delegates, these aren't Trump supporters. These are local Republican dignitaries, many of them who'd have been in Shanker's side. They would be Rubio supporters. All the states have different way of allocating who is their delegates. So all across America, it's their great moment. They go to their Republican convention as the delegate of their state every 4 years. And a lot of them, although they are required to vote for Trump, if that's how their state has voted on their first vote, they don't have to afterwards. So suddenly you could have this whole band of delegates, just because he has, 1,100 or 1,200, or however many he might have ahead of that convention, doesn't mean after that first vote that's happened, anything could start to happen.
Yeah, that may mean that it's not the Republican Party establishment who decides what happens at all, but lots of people from Florida who we've never heard of.
But they are, although they're not the Republican establishment high ups, they are people who are probably more anti-Trump because of their seniority, because of their record in the party. And so the danger for Trump is that if he doesn't win that first vote, he might not get the nomination.
What you probably do have, though, if he gets the nomination, is a guy who is running as an anti-establishment candidate, in all likelihood up against the most establishment candidate that any party has put up in 4 decades, in Hillary Clinton. This is not just a phenomenon that's confined to the Republican Party. Is the Bernie Sanders phenomenon the same as the Trump thing? How is it subtly different? And what has that done to Hillary Clinton in terms of where she now is positioned, would you say?
I think it's a parallel phenomenon and is a response to many of exactly the same things that that we've said on this panel. I mean, the same economic phenomenon, the same obviously not the same cultural phenomenon. I didn't think Bernie Sanders has a wife who's we're going to worry about whether she was posing nude for GQ right now, but he's clearly the anger in the country, or whatever it is, the dissatisfaction is, that on the left wing is focused on him. And of course, it's very interesting, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later, that you have in America a phenomenon which is now very common in many European countries, which is the sort of, the far left and the far right now have the same policies and now agree on many things. Yeah. And are in unity against the center. Yep. That's now true in many countries.
We'll come back to that. Shankar, because of the similarity of the phenomenon, does that mean that Trump is able to steal some of those votes from the sort of Sanders wing of the Democrats? I mean, if you look at the national polls, Trump is actually trailing even Bernie Sanders as a national candidate. He's certainly trailing Hillary Clinton at the moment. But is it possible for him to peel those things away? Is it possible that he can, break up the Democratic Party kind of following as well?
Yeah, well, I think what Anne just said about the sort of fusion of conventional left and right-wing parties on economic policy particularly is happening here. And you see Trump and Sanders' economic policies on trade and so forth virtually identical. I mean, very, very similar policies. And people who are voting for for Sanders, are voting for the same, policies that we're talking about here in terms of protectionism. And so, I think that there's a significant number of Sanders voters whose second vote would be Trump. So I think there's a significant number of those. I think national polls in US presidential elections are not particularly helpful because you have a vast majority of states that are already decided. And then you have these battleground states that are the key ones. Now, unfortunately, the battleground states are precisely the states where this issue is very, very hot. And those states, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, these are the states where the election's going to be won and lost. And in the counties where Bernie Sanders does really well and has done really well in the primary against Hillary Clinton, either gets very close to her or beats her, these are the same counties that Donald Trump is doing very well in. So one can see, winning, picking up a lot of those counties, and you don't have to win. The country is very, very split anyway. Forget this current wave. So you don't actually have to pick up that many of these states to actually win an election, and it is a foreseeable result that Trump could pick up Ohio, could pick up Michigan, could pick up potentially even Pennsylvania, maybe even Florida, in which case the election's not even going to be close. Now you add to that the fact that Hillary Clinton is the establishment candidate in a year where everyone is really strongly opposed to the establishment. You add to the fact that she's not a very good campaigner. She's not someone who's going to really motivate her base. People come out they don't love Hillary Clinton. Even the Democrat voters don't love Hillary Clinton. So, and then you have the indictment, then you have all the email stuff and everything else. It's not impossible by any means that he ends up, winning.
Tim, draw us some transatlantic parallels here. We've got Jeremy Corbyn in this country. There's UKIP as well. What is this the same thing? Are there differences? Is Corbyn Trump? Is he Sanders? Where does this all fit together?
I think we should be alive to the possibility that we are not immune from this sort of phenomenon, because I think what is happening all at the same time are a number of things that each on their own would disrupt politics. So you have, for example, the economic crash of 7-8 years ago, where 1% of Americans think that justice was done, to the bankers and the politicians who caused the mess. 85% think justice wasn't done. Similar numbers, I'm sure, would exist in Britain. You've got that economic stagnation, that slow growth that I mentioned. You've got the fact that social media has completely burst open the normal gatekeeping role of the traditional media. So Donald Trump largely communicates to his fans through Twitter and other means, and he can completely bypass the conventional media. And as Jeb Bush said, he's played the conventional media like a Stradivarius. The conventional media just cover him all of the time, and it's in their interest. CNN's numbers are often up by about 65% on days, just because people are tuning in to find out what Trump is saying.
This is what happened in Italy. This is how Berlusconi won. Mm-hmm.
And you've got other factors, like the fact that the political class has reached the end of the road with the Blair, Clinton, Schroeder way of doing politics. There was a set of policy tools targeting marginal seats, all dressing in the same particular way, that voters are tired of that sort of opinion poll chasing. There's a desire for authenticity. All these factors exist not just in Britain, not just in America, but the countries that Anne has been worried about across Europe for a long time as well. And you have free trade and immigration, where the elites are nearly always taking a different position than the grassroots. And David Frum, mentioned already once, he said the public has always been sceptical of free trade. They've never really been persuaded that it benefits them. But they were willing to trust the political class who told them it was okay. But when the political class is in the low esteem, held in the low esteem that it currently is, it means that that's a fatal combination for those two things.
Is this a total sort of doom-laden scenario, Anne? I mean, you've already talked about other countries in Europe. It'd be interesting to hear what you think about some of these other places. I mean, rise of the National Front in France, the reaction that you've seen in Greece and Spain. But in some of these places, moderate voters, as well as the establishment, have managed to fend this off. The National Front didn't win a bunch of...
Yeah, and actually Angela Merkel's still amazingly ahead in Germany.
Well, yeah, and Merkel, if most politicians... David Cameron had Angela Merkel's popularity ratings, he'd be delighted, despite... Is there a toolkit for dealing with this, for leaders, for mainstream parties? What can we learn from these other countries?
Yeah, I'm not sure you can find the toolkit. I would say one of the things we've learned from other countries is that to be very careful about cheering the demise of the left, and that one of the other, I would add to what you just said, which is when you talked about Clinton, Blair, Schroeder, these were sort of left-wing politicians who moved to the center. And it was assumed by everybody that they moved to the center because left-wing politics and left-wing economics weren't working and were perceived to have failed in 1989 and all that. And they moved to the center and they redefined what it meant to be on the left. But what that did is that left sort of, it left the space for radical politics wide open. And a lot of Marine Le Pen's support comes not from disaffected people on the French right. It comes from former Communist Party members. And you have a similar phenomenon in Germany, where the angriest voters voting for this new, more extreme party, which, by the way, isn't even that extreme by a lot of other countries' standards, but by German standards, it's very extreme. A lot of those are former people from the far left, or from what we used to call the mainstream left, and now it's the far left, whatever is the Marxist left. And then we've seen the phenomenon of revival of real Marxist parties, like the British Labour Party and like Syriza in Greece and like Podemos in Spain, which are trying to revive that set of ideas. And so what you have is a group of people who still want to vote for a, revolutionary, redistributionist, the economics of the left, who now vote for far-right parties because they're offering the same thing. I mean, this is one of the things that's almost always ignored about Marine Le Pen when she's written about here. We talk about racism and so on. Actually, she's advocating nationalization of companies. She's advocating an end to, also an end to free trade. I mean, her anti-Europeanism is really about bringing France out of the global market. I mean, that's her motivating. That's one of her most important motivating factors. And in a way, it's a way in which the anti-globalization movement, the sort of anti-capitalist, anti-globalization, has now morphed into the far right in many countries to the degree that it's now actually impossible to pick them apart. I mean, the far left, the far right have almost identical in many countries. It differs from country to country, and there are different historical traditions, but many of them have very similar radical politics, and that absolutely could happen here.
So Tim, you're doing some work on how the centre-right responds to this. In a sense, how do you save capitalism from all these disasters? Just tell us a little bit about that and how you see how can mainstream centre-right parties respond to this?
Well, there's a new publication that Sian was waving at you earlier that you can look at length from the Legatum Institute, prosperityforall.com. Prosperityforall.com, yes. So end of advertising break. But I think what the centre-right needs to realise, and perhaps the events of what's happening in America will ensure there isn't any complacency, was that there was a fear that straight after the crash happened in 2007-8, capitalism was in a massive crisis and that there would be huge political changes. And it didn't happen. And we all relaxed. And we all thought we'd gotten away with it. And right-wing parties did incredibly well all over the world. Even in America, where Barack Obama won presidential elections, the Republican Party advanced in the Senate and the House and across American states to a huge extent.
And he also belongs to that Blair-Clinton tradition. In fact, he wasn't that radical.
Well, Andrew Sullivan says he's basically a Burkean conservative, but we maybe need that discussion for another day.
That's what the drinks do afterwards.
So the right, for start, so there's a long way of beginning to answer your question, Tim. But first of all, it really does need to realise the crisis point for it is now. It really does need to, and perhaps it will start to recognise that. And I think first of all, it needs to start measuring things differently. GDP and other measures are very confusing as to who is benefiting from economic progress. Actually, an awful lot of the economic gain is going to a small number of people. Median wage growth, access to various assets need to be as important as part of the economic debate as some of the conventional ways that we've measured economics. And we have to find a way of, Michael Gove was brilliant at this at a Legatum event at the Tory Party conference last year, of making a distinction between the deserving rich and the undeserving rich. The right has traditionally made a distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. But there are plenty of people in Britain, around the world, because of very regulated property markets, because of flaws underneath, for example, the financial and banking system, subsidies for fossil fuel and green energy, we can go on, where actually it's closeness to government that accounts for their wealth. And why there's a lot of anger out there is not just because the poor cannot get richer, but as Patience Wheatcroft said at one of the Legatum Institute seminars we held, the rich don't seem to get poorer anymore. That there is not much of a ladder and there are no snakes in the system that we currently have. And so conservatives, the right, my answer would be make capitalism competitive rather than cronyist. Dismantle all of these systems of tax and regulation that help the insiders. And if the Tories want an agenda, and this government, as far as I can tell, doesn't have any real agenda at the moment, as it relaunches after the Brexit referendum, whatever that decides, make capitalism work for everybody again. That is the biggest agenda it could possibly have.
And Shankar, is the Republican leadership in all its forms prepared to listen to that? When David Frum made similar arguments a few years ago, he was kicked out of his think tank, he was ostracised by a lot of his friends. Are they now ready to embrace that kind of agenda, do you think?
Well, I'd just like to pick up on one of the things that Tim just said, which is this issue of crony capitalism. And this is something that we really have to get to grips with, and we have to explain, and we have to show the difference between crony capitalism and what is genuinely free and competitive market capitalism. Because the irony of all of this is that the policies that are being adopted by people in reaction to everything you just described, protectionism, populism, nationalism, all of these things are incredibly destructive of wealth. And we looked at some of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's proposals, the few that we could actually had some concrete statements on, and evaluated the cost of these distortions, which are vectors of crony capitalism, essentially, as costing the US economy 6 million jobs. So 6 million American jobs if Donald Trump does all the things that he's said he's done, with the tariff on China, the tariff on Mexico, all of these things. And across various different, and 1 million people pushed into poverty. So if the problem is the rich are remaining rich and the poor, then there are no ladders for the poor, the solution that they're proposing is going to push more people into poverty and destroy jobs, destroy wealth across the economy. So I think what centre-right parties need to do is to find better ways of explaining the cost of all of this and the benefits and the opportunities and the prosperity that you can actually create if you have the kind of regulatory, legal, economic system, Tim, that you talked about, which is one that does not favour the oligarchs, does not favour the crony capitalists, that does allow competition on the merits as an organising principle, that allows you to succeed or fail on the quality of your ideas and your capacity for hard work. That's what's got to be explained, and frankly, I think it has to be explained with real numbers. You get more of what you measure, and we have to actually explain with real numbers what a free and competitive, as opposed to a crony capitalist market actually looks like. If we're unable to do that, if we can't actually put numbers on this, then I think we're just going to be, we're going to continue to have this kind of negative reaction to what people perceive as a rigged game, where the medicine is worse than the disease.
We'll take questions in a second. I just want to ask one quick question to Anne on foreign policy. Whatever happens in America, it would appear that the next administration is more likely to be responsive to these ideas. What does that mean for the world if America is taking a slightly more protectionist approach to things? Does that have a big impact in Europe, elsewhere in the world? What are we going to see a general retrenchment across the piece? I
think Europe in particular should now count on and expect, and we've actually had 8 years of it, and we had a recent, Obama recently explained his views that we should now count on an America which is less engaged in the world and which is less engaged in particular in Europe. Obama has recently been, really actually quite extraordinary interview, has described in which he went on for pages and pages about the Middle East and Africa and Asia, left a paragraph or two for Europe in which he said they're freeloaders. And he was talking about mostly the British and the French in the context of the Libyan war. But I think that's I think if you have a President Clinton or even a President Cruz, you'll still have a traditional American support for NATO. You'll still have American official engagement. I don't see a kind of radical revolution. But I think you should be prepared for less enthusiasm, less interest, essentially continuing along the slope that we've had, for the last 8 years.
And on a personal note, I wrote a little story that made 300 odd words in the Sunday Telegraph about 7 years ago, saying that Obama had handed back the Churchill bust. And it is still quoted to this day in every single article about the special relationship as a symbol of what Anne is talking about. Quite astonishing the way that sort of had a resonance.
And ironically, Obama, you know, if we next have President Trump, Obama will be the last genuinely Atlanticist president. I mean, because he is still an Atlanticist, and he does care about Britain, and he has made a number of very good speeches actually about NATO. And he is the president who's been responsible for reinvigorating NATO's eastern flank and so on, to the extent that it's been done. But you know, after him, you know, that's actually bucking a trend. And after him, it's conceivable that if there is no European foreign policy, if the European powers are not able to find mechanisms and institutions with which they can express their will and you know, particularly in their immediate neighborhood, then there may be chaos.
On this NATO question, I have this opportunity to ask 10,000 Americans 3 questions a day via YouGov, and so today I asked them about NATO, because a few days ago Donald Trump said, you know, we wanted to scale
He's
back.
not interested in NATO.
And so I gave them the choice, which is closest to your view, that America should scale back from NATO, or that at a time of insecurity it was as important to retain it. And it's 44%. And you know, that's the scale of the mood in America. They do feel that they have shouldered burden of the world, or 44% do, for a long time.